The banker's laughter cut through the desert air like a rusty blade as Cordelia Hawthorne stepped off the eastbound train, her fine Philadelphia dress gathering dust from the platform boards. Thaddeus Grimm's voice carried over the scattered crowd with theatrical cruelty, announcing to anyone within earshot that the colored girl thought she owned the broken mesa. The words hung in the heat like a curse. Cora's gloved fingers tightened around her leather satchel. The deed inside felt heavier than it had during the 3-day journey west. She lifted her chin against the stairs, against the whispers that followed Grimm's proclamation like hungry wolves. The crowd pressed closer. Faces weathered by sun and hardship studied her with the cold assessment of predators sizing up prey. A woman in a faded bonnet shook her head slowly. Two men in dusty work clothes exchanged glances that spoke of violence as casually as they might discuss the weather. Grimm stepped forward, his belly straining against a vest that had seen better days. His smile held no warmth, only the satisfaction of a man who enjoyed watching others squirm. "You sure you got off at the right stop, girl?" The question landed like a slap. Cora's throat tightened, but her voice emerged steady and clear. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Mr. Grimm." The banker's eyebrows lifted in mock surprise. He knew her name, had been expecting her. That knowledge settled in her stomach like cold lead. "Well now, got yourself some education, I see. That's real nice." Grimm's tongue darted across his lower lip. But education don't make a deed worth the paper it's printed on, especially when that paper got some questionable markings on it. The crowd murmured agreement. Someone spat into the dust near her feet. Cora reached into her satchel, retrieving the folded document that had changed everything 3 weeks ago. The lawyer in Philadelphia had handed it to her with apologetic ceremony, explaining that her great uncle Josiah Hawthorne had left her his property in the Arizona territory. A man she had never known existed had given her a chance at something she had never dared imagine. "The deed is perfectly legal, sir." "Is it now?" Grimm's voice rose for the benefit of his audience. "See, that's funny. Because old Josiah, he had himself a weak heart. Died real sudden-like before he could get his affairs properly sorted. Makes a man wonder about documents that show up after the fact." The implication struck her like a physical blow. Forgery? In a place like this, surrounded by hostile faces and Grimm's obvious influence, such an accusation could mean more than losing her inheritance. It could mean her life. The crowd pressed closer still. She could smell their sweat, their suspicion, their barely restrained hunger for violence. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain still. A voice cut through the tension like a clean blade. "Ma'am." The crowd parted reluctantly. A man emerged from their ranks, his weathered face set in hard lines beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes spoke of honest work and modest means. Dust coated his boots and the hem of his coat. His dark eyes held something she had not seen since stepping off the train. Respect. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the silver threading through his black hair. Without ceremony, he removed his hat and extended his free hand toward her. "Welcome to your land." The simple words dropped into the gathering like stones into still water. The ripples spread outward in shocked silence, then angry murmurs. Grimm's face darkened to the color of old blood. Cora stared at the offered hand, calloused from years of hard labor, steady as granite. In that moment, she understood that accepting his gesture would align her with whatever enemies this man had made. Refusing it would leave her alone against Grimm and his mob. She reached out and grasped his hand firmly. "Thank you." His grip was warm and solid. He helped her down from the platform with the same courtesy he might have shown any lady, regardless of color. The crowd watched in stunned silence. "Name's Esteban Morales," he said quietly. "I run cattle on the land adjacent to yours. Cordelia Hawthorne, though most folks call me Cora." Grimm found his voice at last, thick with rage. "Morales, you got no business interfering in matters that don't concern you." Esteban settled his hat back on his head with deliberate slowness. When he looked at Grimm, his expression held the patient contempt of a man who had dealt with bullies before. Miss Hawthorne owns the Broken Mesa. That makes her my neighbor. Around here, we look after our neighbors. She don't own nothing until I say she does. That deed needs proper examination by qualified authorities. Then I reckon she'll be staying until those authorities arrive. The challenge hung between them like a drawn blade. Grimm's supporters shifted restlessly, but something in Esteban's bearing gave them pause. This was not a man who backed down easily. Cora studied her unexpected defender. His stance spoke of quiet confidence, the kind that came from facing down trouble before and surviving. Whatever his reasons for helping her, she sensed they ran deeper than simple courtesy. "Where might a lady find proper lodging while these matters get sorted?" she asked. Grimm's laugh returned, harsh and mocking. "Ain't no place in town gonna take your kind, girl. Might as well climb back on that train while you still can." Esteban's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My ranch has a guest room. You're welcome to it as long as needed." The offer sent another wave of shock through the crowd. A Mexican man extending hospitality to a black woman would scandalize decent folks for miles around. Cora realized that Esteban was risking more than his reputation. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Morales." "Esteban, we're neighbors now." Grimm stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're making a mistake, Morales, both of you. This ain't Philadelphia or wherever you come from, girl. This is hard country. Folks who don't know their place tend to find themselves in unfortunate circumstances." The threat needed no translation. Cora felt the weight of hostile eyes, the promise of violence barely held in check. But something had shifted inside her chest, a spark of defiance that Grimm's intimidation only served to kindle brighter. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Grimm, but I intend to examine my property thoroughly before making any decisions about my place." She emphasized the last word deliberately. Grimm's face twisted with fury, but before he could respond, Esteban had taken her arm gently and begun guiding her toward a wagon waiting at the edge of the platform. The crowd parted reluctantly, their sullen faces promising that this confrontation was far from over. As Esteban helped her into the wagon seat, Cora caught sight of her reflection in the train window. The woman staring back looked different somehow. Harder, more resolved. The deed in her satchel felt lighter now, no longer a burden but a weapon. Whatever Josiah Hawthorne had left her, whatever dangers lay ahead, she would face them standing upright. The wagon pulled away from the station, carrying her toward an uncertain future, and the first real ally she had found in this hostile land. The broken mesa rose from the valley floor like a broken promise, its red stone walls scarred by wind and time. Cora stood in the doorway of the abandoned cabin, studying the chaos within. Drawers hung open like hungry mouths. Papers scattered across the floor spoke of a desperate search. Someone had been here before her, recently. Esteban's boots crunched on broken glass behind her. His silence held weight, the kind that came from seeing too much violence in places meant for peace. "Your uncle was a careful man," he said finally. "This ain't his work." Cora knelt beside an overturned trunk, running her fingers through its emptied contents. Moth-eaten clothes and rusted tools. Nothing worth stealing, yet everything had been examined with ruthless thoroughness. They were looking for something specific. The deed wasn't the only paper Josiah kept. The certainty in Esteban's voice made her look up. He was studying the cabin's rear wall where several boards hung loose, revealing the darkness beyond. "You knew him well. Well enough to know he didn't trust banks or bankers." Esteban approached the damaged wall with the careful steps of a man entering dangerous territory. His fingers traced the splintered wood where someone had pried away the boards with violent haste. "Help me move this." Together they cleared away the remaining boards. Behind them lay a cavity carved into the mesa's stone heart. Empty now, but the space held the shape of secrets recently stolen. Cora's stomach tightened. Whatever Josiah had hidden here, Grimm's people had found it first. There might be more. Esteban's words carried the weight of experience. He moved through the cabin with methodical patience, testing floorboards and examining walls. His hands knew the language of hidden spaces. The loose stone revealed itself beneath the cold fireplace, smaller than the wall cavity, easily missed by men in a hurry. Esteban worked it free with gentle persistence. The journal emerged wrapped in oiled cloth, its leather cover darkened by years of handling. Cora accepted it with reverent care, feeling the weight of her uncle's thoughts pressed between its pages. The first entry stopped her breath. Grimm came again today, offered twice what the land is worth. When I refused, he smiled the way a snake smiles before it strikes. The water makes this place valuable, but it's not water he's really after. Esteban watched her face as she read. His own expression remained carefully neutral, but his hands had curled into fists. What does he mean about the water? The broken mesa sits over the only reliable spring for 50 miles. Control this land, you control every ranch and farm in the valley. Esteban's voice carried bitter knowledge. Including mine. Cora turned the page. Her uncle's handwriting grew more urgent with each entry. They killed the Henderson family last month. Made it look like a wagon accident, but I found the bullet holes. 3 families gone this year, all who refused to sell. I won't be the 4th. The words struck her like physical blows. Murder dressed as misfortune, a pattern of elimination disguised as bad luck. How many others? 7 families in 2 years, all accidents according to Sheriff Martinez. Esteban's jaw worked silently. All coincidences. Cora continued reading, her uncle's fear bleeding through the ink. Each entry revealed another piece of Grimm's design. Railroad money backing the purchases. Eastern investors hungry for cheap land. A depot planned for the valley's heart. The final entry made her hands shake. They're coming tomorrow. Saw the riders at sunset, the same ones who visited Henderson before his accident. If something happens to me, whoever inherits this cursed place needs to know the truth. The water is just the beginning. They want every acre between here and the territorial line. The families who have worked this land for generations mean nothing to them. They're building an empire on bones. Esteban read over her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. When he finished, he stepped back and stared out at the mesa's blood-red walls. Josiah died 3 days after writing that. Heart attack, according to Grimm. According to the death certificate Grimm filed. The implications settled between them like poison. A forged document to cover murder, a pattern of elimination masked as natural causes. Cora closed the journal carefully. Her uncle's legacy was more than land and water rights. He had bequeathed her a war. The families he mentions, the ones who have worked this land for generations. My people, Mexican families who have been here since before the territorial government existed. Esteban's voice carried generations of weariness. We have grazing agreements, water rights going back decades, but paper don't mean much when men with guns decide otherwise. The moral weight struck her suddenly. Claiming her inheritance meant validating those old agreements, but it also meant painting a target on families who had already suffered enough. If I fight Grimm, I put them in danger. If you don't fight him, they lose everything anyway. The truth hung between them sharp as a blade. No choice offered safety. Every path led through blood. Esteban moved to the cabin's single window, his silhouette dark against the dying light. Something in his posture spoke of old wounds, battles fought and lost. My father came here with nothing but hands willing to work, built our ranch from desert and determination. Grimm's been trying to take it for 3 years now. How? Lawyers, surveyors who redraw boundary lines in the night. Tax assessments that double without warning. His hands gripped the window frame. Legal theft dressed in proper paperwork. Cora joined him at the window. The valley spread below them in shades of gold and shadow, beautiful and treacherous as a sleeping predator. Why help me? The question emerged softer than intended. Esteban turned to face her, his dark eyes holding depths she was only beginning to fathom. Because you're the first person who might actually win. The admission cost him something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he held himself apart. I'm one woman with a deed that might be worthless. You're Josiah's blood. You've got legal standing and Eastern education. Most importantly, you've got nothing to lose. His smile held no humor. That makes you dangerous. Thunder rolled across the valley without warning. The first drops of rain struck the window glass like scattered tears. We should head back before this gets worse. They gathered the journal and what few intact possessions remained. As they prepared to leave, Cora noticed something that made her pause. Fresh boot prints in the dust outside the door. Large prints recently made. Someone had watched them search the cabin. Esteban saw her discovery and nodded grimly. He helped her into the wagon without comment, but his hand rested on the rifle beneath the seat. The ride back to his ranch passed in tense silence. Rain pelted them with increasing fury, turning the trail into treacherous mud. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stark flashes, revealing empty ridges that might have hidden watching eyes. They reached the ranch as full darkness fell. Esteban's small house offered warmth and shelter, but safety felt as distant as the stars hidden behind storm clouds. Cora sat by the fire, reading deeper into her uncle's journal while Esteban tended the horses. Each page revealed another layer of Grimm's conspiracy. Railroad money, political connections reaching to the territorial capital, a web of corruption spanning hundreds of miles. When Esteban returned, he found her staring into the flames with hollow eyes. "There's more, isn't there?" She handed him the journal without speaking. His face darkened as he read about surveyor bribes and forged death certificates, about families driven from land their ancestors had worked for generations, about a mass grave hidden in the hills above the valley. The fire crackled between them, consuming wood with the same relentless hunger that drove men to consume everything in their path. Outside, the storm raged against the windows with elemental fury. Neither spoke of the boot prints they had seen. Neither mentioned the shadows that seemed to follow them home, but both understood that tomorrow would bring consequences for the secrets they had uncovered. The smoke rose from the cabin's ashes in thin gray ribbons, carrying with it the charred remains of her uncle's sanctuary. Cora stood in the early morning light, watching her inheritance reduced to blackened timber and twisted metal. The fire had consumed everything with surgical precision. Everything except the foundation stones, which bore fresh scratches from boot heels and rifle butts. Esteban crouched beside the ruins, sifting through debris with patient hands. His face held the grim satisfaction of a man whose suspicions had been confirmed. "They came back after we left, made sure nothing survived." Cora's fingers found the journal in her coat pocket. Heavy and warm against her palm, it represented the only evidence that had escaped Grimm's cleansing fire. The irony struck her with bitter clarity. The secrets they had tried to destroy were safely memorized in her mind. "They don't know we found Josiah's hiding place. They will soon enough." Esteban straightened, brushing ash from his hands. His eyes swept the surrounding ridges with automatic caution. Even in daylight, shadows held potential threats. The ride back to his ranch passed through country that seemed different now. Every hill could hide watchers. Every grove of trees might conceal men with rifles. The landscape had transformed from merely hostile to actively dangerous. They found the first sign of escalation at Esteban's fence line. 3 posts cut clean through, the wire coiled into useless tangles. Fresh cattle tracks led away from his property toward the disputed grazing land beyond. How many head? 20. Maybe more. Esteban's jaw worked silently as he counted the missing animals. Month's income gone. Cora studied the severed posts. The cuts were too clean for accident, too precise for casual vandalism. Someone had sent a message written in stolen livestock and destroyed property. "This is about me being here. This is about Grimm losing patience." They continued toward the house, passing more evidence of nighttime visitors. A water trough overturned, its contents soaking uselessly into thirsty earth. Hay scattered from the barn like golden confetti, too contaminated by dirt to feed the remaining cattle. The territorial judge's carriage waited in the yard, its polished black surface reflecting the morning sun. 2 horses stamped impatiently in their traces, well-fed animals that spoke of Eastern money and political connections. Judge Harrison Blackwood emerged from the house as they approached. Tall and thin as a rail spike, he wore his authority with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Miss Hawthorne, I trust you've had time to consider your position." The greeting held no warmth, only the cold efficiency of a bureaucrat conducting distasteful business. Cora dismounted slowly, using the time to study this man who held her fate in his manicured hands. "I've considered many things, Your Honor." "Excellent. Then we can conclude this matter quickly." Blackwood produced a leather portfolio from his carriage. "I've reviewed your documentation thoroughly. I'm afraid there are serious irregularities that cannot be overlooked." Cora accepted the papers he offered. Her uncle's deed had been annotated with red ink, each mark representing a legal challenge to her claim. Signatures questioned, dates disputed, witnesses declared unreliable. These irregularities, when were they discovered? "During my preliminary examination yesterday evening." Blackwood's smile held reptilian satisfaction. "I take my judicial responsibilities very seriously." Yesterday evening, while she and Esteban had been searching the burned cabin, this man had been manufacturing legal justifications for theft. Esteban stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring at her shoulder. His silence spoke volumes about judges who arrived with predetermined verdicts. "What remedy do you propose, Your Honor?" "The deed must be set aside pending further investigation. The property will revert to territorial administration until these matters can be properly resolved." Territorial administration, which meant Grimm's influence and railroad money would determine the final outcome. Her uncle's murder would be validated by legal paperwork and official signatures. How long might such an investigation require? These things take time, years perhaps. Legal thoroughness cannot be rushed. Years. Long enough for Grimm to eliminate any remaining witnesses and consolidate his control over the valley. Long enough for the families who depended on this land to be driven away or worse. Cora folded the papers carefully, her mind racing through possibilities. The law offered no protection when judges could be bought and evidence destroyed. Justice had been corrupted at its source. "I appreciate your diligence, Your Honor. Might I have until this evening to review these findings?" Blackwood's eyebrows lifted in surprise. He had expected immediate capitulation, not requests for delay. "I suppose a few hours would be acceptable. But understand, Miss Hawthorne, these irregularities are quite serious. I strongly advise cooperation with the territorial investigation." The threat needed no translation. Cooperation or face consequences that would make losing the land seem merciful by comparison. After the judge departed, Cora and Esteban sat on his porch in heavy silence. The morning heat pressed down on them with oppressive weight, but neither moved to seek shade. "He's Grimm's man. Has been for years." Esteban's voice carried the weariness of someone who had watched justice perverted too many times. "Railroad money buys more than land around here." Cora opened the journal to passages she had memorized the night before. Her uncle's careful documentation of bribes and political connections read like a roadmap of corruption reaching from local officials to the territorial capital. "There's something else, something I didn't tell you yesterday." Esteban turned to face her, his dark eyes holding patient attention. "Josiah wrote about the other families, the ones who died in accidents." She found the relevant passage and read aloud. "Maria Santos still breathes, though her husband sleeps in Grimm's earth. She hides with her children in the old mining camp above Devil's Canyon. Roberto Vega tends goats in the high country, letting the world believe him dead. They live like ghosts to avoid becoming corpses." The words hung between them in the still air. Survivors. Witnesses who could testify to Grimm's methods if they could be convinced to abandon their hiding places. Devil's Canyon is a hard day's ride. But possible. Esteban studied her face, reading the determination that had crystallized in her features. She was no longer the Eastern lady who had stepped off the train in fine clothes and uncertain hopes. Something harder had emerged from that chrysalis. Grimm's people watched the canyon roads. Then we find another way. The simplicity of her statement masked its implications. Traveling through unmarked wilderness to reach people who had faked their own deaths required skills neither of them possessed in abundance. But alternatives had narrowed to this single thread of possibility. Even if we find them, even if they agree to testify, Blackwood won't listen. He's already decided. Then we find someone who will. Cora closed the journal and met his gaze directly. In her eyes, Esteban saw something that made him straighten unconsciously. Not desperation, but the cold resolve of someone who had counted the cost and chosen to pay it. The territorial marshal makes his rounds through Prescott every month. If we can reach him with evidence and living witnesses. That's 2 weeks away. Then we have 2 weeks to gather what we need. The audacity of the plan settled between them. Tracking down people who had spent months perfecting their invisibility. Convincing them to risk everything on the word of strangers. Evading Grimm's surveillance while crossing hostile territory with minimal supplies. Any reasonable person would have called it impossible. Esteban found himself nodding slowly. We'll need supplies, horses that can handle rough country, and someone to watch your ranch while we're gone. My cousin Miguel owes me favors. He'll keep an eye on things. They began planning with the methodical patience of people who understood that mistakes would be measured in lives. Routes through the high country where riders could travel unobserved. Water sources and shelter in land that offered neither generously. As the afternoon wore toward evening, Judge Blackwood returned for his answer. He found Cora waiting on the porch, her posture composed and her expression unreadable. Have you reached a decision, Miss Hawthorne? I have. She stood slowly, every movement deliberate and controlled. I intend to fight your ruling through every legal avenue available. Blackwood's face darkened with genuine surprise. He had expected fear, capitulation, perhaps tears and pleading. Instead, he faced quiet defiance that seemed to draw strength from his disapproval. That would be most unwise. The territorial courts look unfavorably on frivolous appeals. Then they'll have to decide whether justice is frivolous, Your Honor. The judge departed in obvious displeasure, his carriage wheels raising dust clouds that hung in the still air long after he disappeared. Cora watched until the last trace of his passage faded into the distance. Tomorrow would bring new dangers. Tonight, she and Esteban would finalize their desperate gamble. The sun sank toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. In that light, even the barren landscape looked beautiful, almost beautiful enough to be worth dying for. The jail cell stank of unwashed bodies and broken dreams. Esteban sat on the narrow cot, his wrists still bearing marks from the iron shackles Sheriff Martinez had clamped on him 3 hours before dawn. Through the barred window, he could see Cora pacing the boardwalk outside, her movements sharp with barely controlled fury. The charges were cattle rustling. 20 head missing from the broken mesa, found conveniently grazing on Esteban's land. The same cattle that had been driven off by wire cutters in the night, now returned to frame the man who had tried to protect them. Grimm's boots echoed on the jailhouse steps. His shadow fell across the cell floor before his bulk filled the doorway, keys jangling from his thick fingers. Thought you might want to reconsider your position, Morales. Esteban remained seated, his dark eyes fixed on the wall beyond Grimm's shoulder. Speaking would only feed the banker's satisfaction. See, the way I figure it, you got maybe 3 days before Judge Blackwood returns to conduct your trial. 3 days to think about what happens to cattle thieves in this territory. The threat hung in the stale air between them. Everyone knew the penalty for rustling. A rope and a tall tree, justice dispensed with frontier efficiency. Course, a man might avoid such unpleasantness if he convinced certain stubborn ladies to see reason about property disputes. Grimm's smile revealed teeth stained by tobacco and malice. He was offering Esteban's life in exchange for Cora's surrender. A trade dressed in legal language but rooted in murder. Through the window, Esteban watched Cora stop her pacing. She stood perfectly still in the morning light, her posture rigid with the kind of rage that burned cold and deep. Her hands hung loose at her sides, but he could see the tension coiled in her shoulders. She was planning something. Your lady friend seems distressed, shamed to see such a pretty woman worry herself over a lost cause. Esteban's jaw tightened involuntarily. Grim caught the reaction and his smile widened. Maybe I should offer her some comfort, help her understand the realities of her situation. The banker moved closer to the cell bars, his breath reeking of whiskey and decay. His fingers wrapped around the iron with possessive familiarity. You know what I learned about that deed of hers? Real interesting story behind it. Seems old Josiah had himself some irregularities in his land purchases. Signatures that don't match. Dates that don't add up. Esteban finally looked at him directly. Grimm's eyes held the cold satisfaction of a predator savoring cornered prey. Funny how these irregularities keep showing up when Judge Blackwood examines property documents. Makes a man wonder if the good judge might not be seeing things that ain't really there. The confession was casual, almost conversational. Grimm felt so secure in his position that he could admit to forgery and judicial corruption without fear of consequences. The railroad boys are getting impatient. They want that depot built before winter, which means clearing out the remaining holdouts by month's end. Grimm's voice dropped to a whisper. Your people got anywhere else to go, Morales. Because if they don't, well, accidents happen. The casual mention of mass displacement struck Esteban harder than direct threats to his own life. Families who had worked this land for generations, reduced to refugees by Eastern greed and political corruption. 3 days, Grimm repeated, stepping back from the cell. Tell your lady to think real careful about her choices. After the banker left, Esteban moved to the window. Cora had disappeared from the boardwalk, but he could feel her presence somewhere nearby. Planning, calculating, refusing to accept the impossible situation that had trapped them both. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Maria Santos entered the jailhouse with careful steps, her face hidden beneath a worn shawl. Behind her came Roberto Vega, his beard grown long and streaked with premature gray. 2 ghosts made flesh, emerging from their mountain hiding places. Sheriff Martinez looked up from his desk with obvious discomfort. These were people he had declared dead, their presence an uncomfortable reminder of official lies he had been paid to tell. We want to see the prisoner. Maria's voice carried the authority of someone who had lost everything except dignity. The sheriff hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting Grimm to materialize with orders. Visiting hours are over. Then we'll wait for them to begin again. The simple statement held enough quiet determination to make the sheriff reconsider. He unlocked the cell door with obvious reluctance, allowing the visitors to enter Esteban's cramped quarters. Maria moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to avoiding attention. Roberto's eyes swept the jail with automatic caution, cataloging exits and potential threats. The woman from the east, she found us. Esteban nodded slowly. Cora had succeeded where he had thought success impossible. Tracking down people who had perfected the art of invisibility required skills he had underestimated. She knows about the others, the families Grimm murdered. Maria's voice dropped to barely audible whispers. She has proof. Roberto leaned closer, his weathered hands gripping the cell bars. Judge Blackwood ain't the only territorial official on railroad payroll, goes all the way to the capital. The revelation struck Esteban with cold certainty. Even if they could present evidence of Grimm's crimes, the corrupted legal system would find ways to dismiss or discredit testimony that threatened profitable arrangements. Then we're fighting shadows. Maybe. But the territorial marshal ain't been bought yet. Word is he's clean, far as anyone can tell. A thread of hope, thin as spider silk but stronger than despair. Marshal Wade Coleman had a reputation for honesty that even railroad money hadn't been able to purchase. When does he reach Prescott? 10 days, maybe less if the weather holds. 10 days. Longer than Esteban had before his trial, but close enough to matter if they could delay the proceedings somehow. Maria reached through the bars to grasp his hand briefly. Her fingers were cold but steady. The woman says she has a plan, something about exposing everything at once, making it too public for them to cover up. What kind of plan? The kind that gets people killed if it goes wrong. Roberto's assessment hung in the air between them. They all understood the stakes. Grimm had murdered entire families to protect his conspiracy. He would not hesitate to eliminate threats before they could reach federal authorities. She's going to need help. People willing to stand up when the moment comes. How many people you talking about? Everyone. Every family in the valley. Everyone who's lost land or loved ones to Grimm's operation. The scope of what Cora was proposing began to crystallize in Esteban's mind. Not just testimony from hidden survivors, but a public uprising of everyone who had suffered under Grimm's reign. Safety through numbers and publicity. That's a lot of trust to place in one woman. Maria's smile held grim humor. She's got more sand than most men I've known. Found us in country that swallowed entire search parties. Convinced us to risk everything on the word of strangers. Her endorsement carried weight. Maria had survived months in hiding, evading searchers while protecting her children. Her judgment of character had been tested by circumstances that revealed truth beneath surface appearances. What does she need from me? Time. Keep Grimm focused on you while she sets everything in motion. The request was simple in concept, potentially fatal in execution. Drawing Grimm's attention meant becoming the primary target of a man who had demonstrated casual willingness to commit murder. And if her plan fails, Roberto's expression grew somber, then we all die anyway. At least this way, we die fighting. The visitors left as quietly as they had arrived, slipping away before the sheriff could reconsider his decision to allow the meeting. Esteban watched them disappear into the gathering dusk, two people who had chosen to trust their lives to a woman they barely knew. Night fell over the jail with oppressive weight. Through his cell window, Esteban could see lights flickering in distant windows, each one representing a family whose future hung in the balance of Cora's desperate gamble. Somewhere in the darkness, she was moving pieces into position for a confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone in the valley. Success would bring justice and freedom. Failure would bring systematic elimination of everyone who had dared to resist. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him with crushing force. Tomorrow would bring another day of waiting, another 24 hours for doubt to erode resolve. But tonight, for the first time since his arrest, hope felt stronger than fear. In the distance, a coyote's howl echoed across the valley, a wild sound, untamed and free, the sound of something that refused to be caged. The courthouse filled with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, their collective breath fogging the windows in the morning chill. Cora stood at the back of the room, her dark dress blending with the shadows while her eyes tracked every face in the crowd. Mexican families who had emerged from hiding, Anglo settlers who had lost land to Grimm's schemes, even some of the bankers' former allies, their expressions troubled by doubts they could no longer ignore. Judge Blackwood sat behind the bench with visible discomfort, his usual arrogance replaced by nervous energy. He had expected a simple, cattle-rustling trial with a predetermined outcome. Instead, he faced a packed courtroom buzzing with dangerous undercurrents. Esteban entered in shackles, his head held high despite the iron chains. His eyes found Cora's across the crowded room, and something passed between them. Not words, but understanding. Today would end one way or another. This court is now in session. The territory versus Esteban Morales, charged with cattle theft. Blackwood's voice carried forced authority, but Cora detected the tremor beneath his judicial composure. He knew something had changed. The question was whether he would maintain his corrupt bargain or preserve his own skin. Sheriff Martinez presented the evidence with mechanical precision. 20 head of cattle found on Esteban's property. No bill of sale. No legitimate explanation for their presence. The case appeared straightforward to anyone ignorant of the larger conspiracy. Cora waded through the sheriff's testimony, allowing Grimm's confidence to build. The banker sat in the front row, his bulk settled comfortably in the wooden chair as he watched his carefully orchestrated plan unfold. When Martinez finished, Cora stood slowly. The movement rippled through the courtroom as every eye turned toward her. She walked down the center aisle with measured steps, her heels clicking against the wooden floor with deadly precision. "Your Honor, I request permission to present evidence relevant to these charges." Blackwood's eyebrows lifted in manufactured surprise. "This is a cattle-rustling trial, Miss Hawthorne. Your property dispute has no bearing on these proceedings." The dismissal was too quick, too absolute. Cora had expected this response and prepared accordingly. "The evidence I wish to present concerns a pattern of false accusations designed to eliminate witnesses to murder." The word dropped into the packed courtroom with explosive force. Murmurs erupted from the gallery as people processed the implication. Grimm's face darkened to the color of old blood. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Hawthorne. Do you have proof to support such claims?" Blackwood's question was meant as dismissal, but Cora heard genuine uncertainty beneath the judicial language. He was weighing his options, calculating whether maintaining his corrupt bargain was worth the risk of exposure. "I do, Your Honor." Cora produced Josiah's journal from her coat, its leather cover worn smooth by countless readings. She had memorized every page, every damning detail of Grimm's conspiracy. This document details a systematic campaign of murder and land theft spanning 2 years. It names specific victims, describes methods used to eliminate them, and identifies co-conspirators including territorial officials. The courtroom erupted in shocked voices. Blackwood's gavel cracked against the wooden block repeatedly, but the noise continued unabated. In the front row, Grimm half rose from his seat before settling back with visible effort. "Order. I will have order in this courtroom." When silence finally returned, Blackwood's face had gone pale. He stared at the journal in Cora's hands as if it were a loaded weapon pointed at his heart. Even if such a document exists, it would constitute hearsay evidence inadmissible in these proceedings. Then, perhaps these witnesses can provide direct testimony. Cora gestured toward the back of the courtroom. Maria Santos rose from her seat, throwing back the shawl that had hidden her features. Gasps echoed through the room as people recognized a woman they had mourned as dead. Roberto Vega stood beside her, his presence equally shocking to those who had attended his funeral months earlier. One by one, other supposed victims emerged from the crowd, men and women who had faked their deaths to escape Grimm's murderous attention. These people can testify to threats made against them, to family members who refused to fake their deaths and paid the ultimate price, to a conspiracy that reaches from this courthouse to the territorial capital. Blackwood's hands shook as he gripped his gavel. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The weight of exposed corruption pressed down on him with crushing force. In the front row, Grimm finally lost his composure entirely. He surged to his feet, his voice booming across the stunned courtroom. "This is nonsense. Wild accusations from desperate people trying to avoid the consequences of their crimes." But his protests fell on deaf ears. The crowd had turned against him, their faces reflecting years of suppressed anger and grief. They had heard too many convenient explanations, witnessed too many coincidental accidents. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, his hand resting on his sidearm. For the first time since the trial began, he looked directly at Grimm with something approaching professional suspicion. "Maybe we should hear what these folks have to say." The simple statement marked a crucial turning point. Martinez had finally chosen justice over corruption, duty over intimidation. His support gave official weight to the accusations swirling around the packed courtroom. Blackwood found himself trapped between conflicting loyalties. Maintaining his corrupt bargain meant ignoring overwhelming evidence presented before dozens of witnesses. But abandoning Grimm meant confessing his own complicity in the conspiracy. "This court will take a brief recess to consider these developments." The judge's retreat bought him time but solved nothing. As he disappeared into his chambers, the courtroom exploded into animated conversation. Grimm stood alone in the center of the storm, his political allies melting away with the speed of desert ice. Cora moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and words of support, but her attention remained focused on the judge's chambers, where Blackwood wrestled with a decision that would determine everyone's fate. 20 minutes later, he returned with visible reluctance. His face had aged years in the brief interval, bearing the weight of consequences he could no longer avoid. After careful consideration, this court finds insufficient evidence to proceed with the charges against Esteban Morales. The defendant is hereby released. The words triggered celebration throughout the courtroom, but Cora noticed what Blackwood had not said. No mention of investigating Grimm's conspiracy. No promise of justice for the victims whose stories had been revealed. Sheriff Martinez unlocked Esteban's shackles with trembling hands. As the iron fell away, the crowd pressed forward to embrace the freed man. But their celebration was premature. Grimm had not accepted defeat. He stood near the courthouse door, his eyes scanning the crowd with predatory calculation. When his gaze found Cora, his smile held promise of violence yet to come. The banker pushed through the crowd with deliberate slowness, ignoring the hostile stares that followed his movement. He stopped directly in front of Cora, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You think you've won something here, girl, but this valley ain't big enough for everyone who thinks they can stand against progress." The threat was delivered in conversational tones, but everyone within earshot understood its implications. Grimm was declaring war on anyone who had supported the day's revelations. Esteban moved to Cora's side, his presence solid and reassuring. Around them, the crowd closed ranks protectively. For the first time in years, the valley's residents stood united against their common oppressor. "The territorial marshal will want to investigate these accusations," Sheriff Martinez announced loudly. "I'll be sending a full report of today's proceedings to his office." Martinez had finally found his courage, but it might have come too late. Grimm's network of corruption extended far beyond the local courthouse. By the time federal authorities could respond, key witnesses might disappear permanently. As the crowd began to disperse, Cora felt the weight of unfinished business pressing down on her shoulders. They had won a battle, but the war for the valley's future was far from over. In the gathering dusk, storm clouds massed on the horizon. The coming night would test whether their fragile coalition could survive Grimm's inevitable retaliation. Thunder rolled across the desert, carrying with it the promise of cleansing rain or devastating flood. The choice was no longer in their hands. The federal marshal's badge caught the morning light as Wade Coleman stepped down from the territorial coach, his weathered face scanning the crowd that had gathered at the depot. Word of his arrival had spread through the valley faster than wildfire, drawing people from ranches and farms scattered across the harsh landscape. Cora stood among them, Josiah's journal pressed against her chest beneath her coat. 3 weeks had passed since the courthouse confrontation. 3 weeks of nervous waiting while Grimm's influence worked to suppress the investigation. But Coleman's presence meant federal authority had finally reached their forgotten corner of the territory. The marshal was older than expected, his gray hair speaking of decades spent enforcing law in places where justice came hard and corruption ran deep. His eyes held the steady patience of a man who had learned to separate truth from deception through bitter experience. Sheriff Martinez approached with obvious reluctance, his badge reflecting light that seemed to burn rather than illuminate. The local lawman had tried to bury the evidence after the trial, but too many witnesses had spoken too loudly for complete suppression. Coleman's first action was to establish temporary headquarters in the courthouse, the same building where Blackwood had attempted to orchestrate Esteban's conviction. The symbolic significance was lost on no one. Federal justice had arrived to challenge territorial corruption. One by one, the witnesses came forward to testify. Maria Santos spoke of her husband's murder with quiet dignity, her words carrying the weight of suppressed grief. Roberto Vega detailed the systematic intimidation that had driven families from land their ancestors had worked for generations. Cora presented her uncle's journal with formal ceremony, watching Coleman's expression darken as he read account after account of orchestrated violence and judicial corruption. The federal marshal asked few questions, but his silence held more condemnation than angry words could have conveyed. When Grimm finally appeared before the makeshift tribunal, his usual bluster had evaporated. The banker sat hunched in his chair, his bulk seeming to collapse inward under the weight of accumulated evidence. His political connections meant nothing here. Federal authority superseded territorial corruption. Coleman's investigation moved with methodical thoroughness. Bank records revealed payments to territorial officials. Forged documents crumbled under expert examination. The web of conspiracy that had seemed unbreakable weeks earlier disintegrated under federal scrutiny. Judge Blackwood's arrest came at dawn, federal deputies finding him preparing to flee toward the territorial capital. His judicial robes lay abandoned on the floor of his chambers, symbolic of justice perverted and authority betrayed. The territorial government recalled remaining officials implicated in the conspiracy, their careers ending in disgrace rather than retirement. Railroad money could buy local corruption, but federal investigation exposed the true cost of such arrangements. Within a month, the valley had transformed. Families emerged from hiding to reclaim their ancestral lands. Shops reopened as fear-driven exodus reversed into cautious return. The broken mesa became what Josiah had always intended, the heart of a thriving community rather than a contested prize. Cora's deed was validated without challenge, but she chose to honor the water-sharing agreements that had sustained the valley for generations. Her decision to establish a school on the property drew families from throughout the territory, creating the first integrated educational institution in the region. Children of different backgrounds played together in the shade of the old cottonwood trees, their laughter echoing across land that had witnessed too much suffering. Their innocence offered hope that future generations might inherit cooperation rather than conflict. Esteban expanded his ranch with federal assistance, providing employment for families displaced by Grimm's conspiracy. His cattle grazed peacefully alongside neighbors who had once viewed him with suspicion, their shared struggle having forged bonds stronger than prejudice. The partnership between Cora and Esteban deepened through the long work of rebuilding. Their relationship had been forged in crisis, tempered by shared danger, and now grew into something richer through common purpose. They stood together at community meetings, their combined voices carrying weight that neither could have achieved alone. Federal investment replaced railroad exploitation as the driving force behind regional development. Roads were built to serve existing communities rather than bypass them. Telegraph lines connected the valley to territorial government without surrendering local autonomy. The old depot where Cora had first faced Grimm's mockery became a symbol of transformation. Families now arrived to join the growing community rather than flee from systematic oppression. Each train brought new residents drawn by stories of successful resistance to corruption. Marshal Coleman remained in the valley for 6 months, ensuring that federal reforms took root in soil previously poisoned by territorial corruption. His presence provided stability during the difficult transition from fear to hope. When he finally departed, the community gathered at the same depot platform where Cora's journey had begun. The federal marshal's final words were characteristically brief but heavy with meaning. Justice delayed ain't justice denied, long as there's people willing to fight for what's right. The train carrying Coleman eastward disappeared into morning haze, but his legacy remained in the form of honest law enforcement and accountable government. Sheriff Martinez had been replaced by a deputy with federal backing, ensuring that corruption could not easily return. Years passed like seasons, each one building upon the foundation laid by that desperate gamble in the courthouse. The community that emerged bore little resemblance to the fearful valley Cora had first encountered. Children who had learned to read in her integrated schoolhouse grew into adults who carried their education throughout the territory. Some became teachers themselves, spreading the model of cooperation they had witnessed firsthand. Others became merchants, ranchers, and civic leaders, their success proving that communities built on justice rather than exploitation could thrive in the harsh landscape of the American frontier. Cora and Esteban aged together, their partnership deepening through decades of shared challenges and mutual respect. They never married in the formal sense, but their commitment to each other and their community created bonds stronger than legal documents. The Broken Mesa became a destination for travelers seeking proof that the American dream could extend beyond racial boundaries. Politicians visited to study their integrated institutions. Journalists came to document their economic success. Scholars arrived to understand how cooperation had triumphed over conflict. But for those who lived there, the valley's significance lay not in its symbolic importance but in its daily reality. Children played without fear. Families prospered through honest work. Justice could be found in local courts. The train platform where Grimm had once mocked Cora's aspirations now welcomed visitors from across the nation. The community that had emerged from desperate resistance had become a beacon of what America might achieve when courage confronted corruption. In the evening light, Cora and Esteban often stood together watching children play beneath the ancient cottonwoods. Their hair had grown gray, their hands weathered by decades of work, but their eyes still held the determined fire that had sustained them through their darkest hours. The land their struggle had preserved continued to nurture new generations, proving that some victories endure beyond the lives of those who achieve them. The desert wind carried their laughter across valleys where hope had taken root in soil once watered by tears. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.